I thought becoming his wife would be the moment my life ended, but the truth was far worse. It was the moment his began. The chapel smelled like white roses and cold marble, and something heavier, something I couldn't name. My fingers tightened around the bouquet as whispers moved through the room, not about love, not about vows, but about him. Luca de Luca, the man who didn't ask twice, the man who didn't need to. When the doors opened, every sound disappeared, not faded, vanished like the world itself held its breath. He walked in slow, controlled, every step measured, like he already owned everything in front of him, including me. I had seen pictures of him before, headlines, rumors, shadows of a life I never wanted, but none of it prepared me for the way his eyes found mine. Not warm, not curious, just certain, like he had already decided who I was and what I would become. I told myself not to look down, not to break first, because something deep inside me refused to disappear completely, even here, even now. The ceremony passed in fragments, words I didn't hear, promises I didn't choose. The ring felt colder than I expected, heavier, like it carried more than gold, more than a name. When he slid it onto my finger, his touch was brief, but it burned, not pain, not comfort, something in between, something that made my pulse stutter, and I hated that my body reacted at all. By the time the applause started, I realized something terrifying. No one here was celebrating, they were witnessing. Like this wasn't a wedding, it was a transaction sealed in silence. The drive to his estate took exactly 42 minutes. I counted every second because it was the only thing I could control. Outside the window, the city lights blurred into nothing, replaced by long empty roads and gates that opened before we even stopped, like they were expecting him, like the world always did. Inside the car, he said nothing, and somehow that was worse than anything he could have said. Silence wrapped around me tight and suffocating until I finally spoke, my voice quieter than I intended. You don't have to do this. The words sounded weak even to me, but they were all I had. He turned his head slowly, his gaze settling on me again, and for a moment I wished he hadn't, because there was no hesitation there, no doubt, just calm certainty. It's already done, he said, and looked away, like that was the end of it, like I was already something placed in his life, something owned. The gates closed behind us with a low mechanical hum, and I felt it in my chest like a final lock clicking into place. I stepped out of the car into a world that didn't feel real. The air colder, the silence deeper, the house rising in front of me like it had been there forever, waiting for someone like me, someone who didn't belong. I followed him inside because I had no other choice, and every step echoed louder than the last until we reached the door at the end of a long hallway. He stopped, his hand resting on the handle just for a second before pushing it open. I should have been afraid, I should have been shaking, but all I felt was something sharper, something stubborn and alive, because no matter what he thought, no matter what this marriage meant, I wasn't something that could be owned. And when I stepped into that room, I had no idea that everything I believed was about to be tested in a single night. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than anything I had ever heard, and for a second I stood there, not moving, not breathing, just listening to the silence pressing in from every corner of the room. It was not a bedroom. It was something colder, something controlled, every surface perfect, every detail untouched, like no one actually lived here, like this space existed only for moments like this. I wrapped my arms around myself, not because I was cold, but because it felt like the only way to hold on to who I was. Before all of this, Luca walked past me without a word, his jacket slipping off his shoulders with effortless precision as he placed it over a chair, like he had done it 1,000 times before. Like tonight was no different than any other night, and maybe for him it was not. Maybe this was just another arrangement, another contract fulfilled, but for me it felt like standing at the edge of something I could not see. Look at me. His voice was low, not raised, not harsh, but it still made my body react like a command I did not want to follow. Slowly, I turned my head, meeting his eyes again, and there it was, that same unreadable expression, calm, controlled, but underneath something sharper, something waiting. He stepped closer, not rushed, not hesitant, just inevitable, each step closing the distance until I could feel it, the shift in the air between us like pressure building before a storm. My heart started to beat faster, not out of fear, not entirely, but because I could feel him watching me, not just looking but studying every movement, every breath, like he was trying to understand something that did not make sense to him. His hand lifted, and for a second I thought I would pull away. I should have, but I did not. His fingers brushed against my wrist, light controlled, and then he stopped completely. The shift was instant, like something inside him locked into place. His eyes dropped to my hand, then slowly back to my face, and for the first time since I met him, something cracked, not weakness, not softness, something else, something unfamiliar. Who did this to you? He asked quietly. The question caught me off guard, my breath hitching as confusion replaced everything else. What? I whispered. His grip did not tighten, but it did not release either, his thumb resting lightly against my pulse like he could feel every beat, every reaction. Who made you think you had to stand here like this, like you were waiting for something to be taken from you? His voice was still calm, but there was something underneath it now, something darker, something that made my chest tighten. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold his gaze. No one, I said, and this time my voice did not shake. No one owns me. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than anything else that had been said tonight. For a moment, neither of us moved, and I saw it clearly, the shift in him, not outward, not something anyone else would notice, but I felt it like the ground beneath me had changed. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, not in disbelief, but in recognition, like I had just said something he had never heard before from someone in my position. His hand dropped from my wrist, slowly, deliberate, like he was choosing to let go instead of being forced to. You are my wife, he said, and the words should have sounded like ownership, like a claim, but they did not. Not entirely. There was something restrained in the way he said it, like he was testing the meaning himself. I shook my head before I could stop myself. That does not mean I belong to you. Silence again, heavier this time, but different, not suffocating, not trapping, something else, something uncertain, and that was. When it happened, a knock, sharp, controlled, broke through the moment the door opened without waiting for permission, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside, his posture rigid, his eyes avoiding mine entirely. Sir, we have a situation. Luca did not look away from me, not immediately, but I saw the change, the way his attention shifted, the way whatever had been building between us snapped back into something colder, more dangerous. Speak, he said finally. The man hesitated just for a fraction of a second before continuing. There are reports your enemies are aware of the marriage. They believe she can be used against you. The words landed hard, even though they were spoken quietly. I felt it immediately, the shift in the room, the temperature dropping, the air tightening. Luca turned his head slowly toward the man, his expression unreadable again, but his voice, when he spoke, was something else entirely. Then they just made the worst mistake of their lives, he said, and when his eyes returned to mine, there was no uncertainty left, only something absolute, something that made my breath catch, because in that moment I realized this was no longer about a contract or a marriage. This was about something far more dangerous, something that had already begun to spiral out of control. The air in the room did not move after he spoke. It settled heavy, like something had just been decided without my permission. I did not fully understand what it meant to be used against a man like him, but I understood enough to know it was not a small thing. Luca stepped away from me slowly, not turning his back completely, like even in his own home, he did not allow that kind of vulnerability. His presence shifted again, colder, sharper. The version of him the world feared returning without hesitation. Handle it, he said to the man by the door, his voice quiet but absolute. The man nodded once and disappeared as quickly as he had entered, leaving the door closing behind him with the same soft final sound that now felt like a warning. I stood there, still trying to catch up to everything that had just happened, my mind racing ahead of my body. What does that mean? I asked before I could stop myself, my voice cutting through the silence. More steady than I felt. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his phone, glancing at the screen, like whatever message waited there mattered more than the question I had just asked, more than me. After a few seconds, he placed it down on the table and finally looked at me again. It means you are no longer invisible, he said simply. The words landed harder than anything else tonight. Invisible? I almost laughed at that, because nothing about this felt invisible, not the way every person in that chapel had looked at me, not the way his name carried through every whisper. But I knew what he meant before today. I was no one, just a girl with a life that stayed within the lines, safe, predictable, small. Now I was connected to him, and that changed everything. I did not ask for this, I said, the frustration finally breaking through, my chest tightening with every word. I did not ask to be part of whatever world this is. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted just slightly, like he had expected that answer. No one ever does, he replied, and for a second it sounded almost like the truth, not a threat, not a dismissal, just a fact that had already been accepted long before I walked into his life. I shook my head, taking a step back, creating space, even though I knew it did not really matter in a house this large, under a name this powerful. Space was an illusion. Then fix it, I said, my voice firmer now. And it undo whatever this is supposed to be. The words felt impossible even as I said them, but I needed to say something, needed to push back against the weight pressing down on me. His gaze held mine steady, unblinking, and I realized too late that I had stepped into something I did not understand. That is not how this works, he said quietly, not angry, not raised, but final. I felt it, then the edge of it, the difference between asking and demanding, and how little either mattered here. I looked away first, not because I wanted to, but because I needed a second to breathe, to think, to find something inside myself that had not already been swallowed by this moment. Then tell me, what does I whispered, more to myself than to him. But he heard it, of course he did. He heard everything. He stepped closer again, not as close as before, but enough that I could feel his presence pulling the air with it. You learn, he said, and the words were not kind, but they were not cruel either, just certain, like everything else about him. You watch, you listen, and you understand that the moment you became my wife, you became part of something that does not disappear when it is inconvenient. I let out a slow breath, my hands curling slightly at my sides, because I did not like the way that sounded, not the meaning, not the certainty behind it. And what happens if I do not want to be part of it? I asked, finally forcing myself to meet his eyes again. Something flickered there, not amusement, not quite approval, something closer to interest, like I had just become more than a problem to solve. That does not change anything, he said, and this time there was no softness, no room left for interpretation, just truth. Cold and unyielding. But before I could respond, before I could push back again, his phone lit up on the table, the screen glowing in the dim light. He glanced at it once, and something in his expression hardened, instantly sharper than before, more dangerous. They are moving faster than I expected, he said, almost to himself. And then his attention snapped back to me, completely focused, completely present. You do not leave this house without me. The command came without hesitation, without explanation, and something in the way he said it made my chest tighten again. Not fear, not exactly, something closer to realization. Because this was not about control, not entirely. This was about something else, something I was only beginning to understand. And as I stood there in a house that did not feel like mine, in a life I did not choose, I realized that whatever had started tonight was already far bigger than either of us. And it was not going to stop. The silence after his command did not feel empty. It felt sealed, like the walls themselves had agreed with him. I should have argued, I should have said something sharp, something defiant, but the way he stood there, watching me, made the words stop before they could form. You do not get to decide that for me, I said anyway, because I needed to hear my own voice, remind myself that I still had one. His gaze did not harden, it did not soften either. It stayed exactly the same, calm and unshaken, like nothing I said could move it. I already did, he replied, and that should have sounded arrogant. It should have made me angrier, but there was something else in it, something grounded in reality that I could not ignore, because deep down I knew he was not speaking from ego. He was speaking from a world that did not ask for permission. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself, trying to hold on to the version of me that existed before tonight, the version that believed in choices and exits and normal endings. Then what am I supposed to do? I asked the question, slipping out quieter than I intended. His eyes stayed on me for a moment longer before he finally moved, turning slightly, as if the conversation had already shifted in his mind. You stay alive, he said. Simply, the words hit harder than anything else because they were not dramatic, not exaggerated, just direct, like a fact that did not need explanation. My chest tightened again, not with fear, but with the weight of what that implied. Before I could respond, a distant sound echoed through the house. Not loud, not obvious, but enough to make him pause, his head tilted slightly, listening in a way that made me realize how different his awareness was from mine. Like he heard things I could not even register. Stay here, he said, and this time it was not just a command. It was something else, something sharper, something that made my instincts react before my thoughts could catch up. He moved toward the door with controlled speed, not rushing, not hesitating, just precise. I stood frozen for a second before taking a step forward. Wait. I called out the word, leaving my mouth before I could stop it. He stopped just long enough to glance back at me, and in that brief second something passed between us, something unspoken, something that made my breath catch, because it did not feel like control, it felt like consideration. Do not make this harder than it already is, he said quietly, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him, leaving me alone in a space that suddenly felt too large, too quiet. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, like it might open again, like this could all reset somehow. But it did not. The silence stretched longer this time, heavier, filled with thoughts I did not want to have. I moved slowly across the room, my steps echoing softly against the floor until I reached the window outside. The ground stretched wide and empty, lights lining the path like a boundary I could not cross. I wrapped my arms around myself again, not from cold, but from the strange feeling settling in my chest. Because for the first time since this started, I realized something unsettling. I was not just trapped here, I was being protected, and I did not know which one was worse. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time felt different here, slower, heavier, like it did not move unless he did. I turned away from the window, pacing once, twice, trying to think of anything that could give me a sense of control again, but every thought led back to the same place: him, his words, his presence, the way he had looked at me like I was something he did not fully understand. And that was when the door opened again, sudden but controlled. I turned quickly, my heart jumping before I could stop it. Lucas stepped back, inside, his expression unreadable, but something had changed, not visibly, not in a way I could name, but I felt it immediately, the air shifting again around him. Pack what you need, he said, his voice low, steady like everything else about him, but there was urgency there now, quiet but real. I blinked at him, confused. What? I asked, the word barely leaving my lips before he continued. We are leaving, he said, and for the first time since I met him, I saw it clearly, not fear, not panic, but something close to anticipation, like whatever was coming next had already been decided, and there was no stopping it. I shook my head slightly, trying to catch up. Leaving where? I asked, but even as I said it, I knew the answer would not be simple. His eyes held mine for a second longer before he spoke again. Somewhere they cannot reach you, he said, and that was the moment everything inside me shifted again, because this was no longer about a house or a marriage or even him. This was about survival, and whether I wanted it or not, I was already part of it. I did not move right away. The words "pack what you need" echoed in my head like they belonged to someone else, like this was happening to a different version of me, someone who understood how to react in a moment like this. But I did not. I stood there staring at him, trying to find something in his expression that would explain everything that had just shifted, but there was nothing, no hesitation, no doubt, just that same quiet certainty that made everything feel inevitable. How long do I have? I asked finally, my voice steadier than I felt. His eyes flicked briefly toward the door, and then back to me. 5 minutes, he said, and something in my chest tightened again, because 5 minutes was not enough time to leave a life behind, not enough time to decide what mattered and what did not. But I nodded anyway, because arguing would not change anything. I turned away from him, moving toward the closet, my hands already reaching for the first things I saw: clothes. I did not even remember choosing shoes that felt unfamiliar. Everything about this moment felt disconnected, like I was moving through it without fully being inside it. I grabbed a small bag from the shelf, shoving items into it, without thinking, without planning, because there was no time for either. My mind raced ahead, questions stacking on top of each other. Where were we going? How long would we be gone? What was waiting for us on the other side? But none of them felt like they had answers that would make this easier. Behind me, I could feel him still there, not moving, not rushing, just watching, and that awareness did something strange to me. It did not feel like pressure, it felt like gravity, like everything in this room was being pulled toward him, whether it wanted to or not. You are not taking much. His voice cut through my thoughts, not critical, not questioning, just observant. I paused for a second, my hand hovering over the edge of the bag before I looked back at him. I do not have anything worth taking, I said quietly, and for the first time since I met him, something in his expression shifted, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it, like a small fracture in something otherwise unbreakable. He stepped closer again, not invading, not forcing, just closing the space between us until I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me. That is not true, he said, and the way he said it made my breath catch, because it did not sound like a correction. It sounded like a statement of fact, like he saw something I did not. But before I could ask what he meant, he reached past me, his hand brushing against mine for the briefest second, as he picked up the bag, zipping it closed with one smooth motion. The contact was light, controlled, but it lingered longer than it should have in my thoughts, longer than I wanted it to. We do not have time for hesitation, he continued, his voice returning to that steady, controlled tone that seemed to define everything about him. I nodded again, even though I did not feel ready, even though I did not feel anything close to prepared, but ready or not did not seem to matter here. He handed the bag back to me, his fingers releasing it slowly, like he was making sure I had a firm grip before letting go completely. Stay close to me, he said, and this time there was no edge of command, no underlying threat, just something direct, something almost protective. And that unsettled me more than anything else, because I did not know what to do with that version of him, the one that did not fit the image I had built in my head from everything I had heard everything I had assumed. We moved quickly after that through the hallway, down the stairs, past rooms I had not even seen, yet the house no longer felt like a place. It felt like a path, something we were moving through rather than something we belonged in. Outside, the air hit me colder, sharper, the night stretching wide and silent around us. A black car waited near the front entrance, engine already running. Like this had been planned long before I understood what was happening. Luca opened the door for me without a word, and I hesitated just for a fraction of a second, my eyes flicking up to his, searching for something, anything that would tell me this was not as final as it felt. But his gaze held mine steady, unchanging, and I realized there was no going back. Not tonight, maybe not ever. I slid into the seat, the leather cold beneath my hands as I gripped the edge, trying to ground myself in something real. He closed the door gently, not rushed, not careless, and then he was on the other side a moment later, the car pulling away before I could fully process the shift, the house disappearing behind us faster than I expected, like it had never really been mine to leave. I looked out the window, the darkness swallowing everything except the faint lines of the road ahead, and for the first time since this started, I felt it clearly. Not fear, not confusion, but something else, something deeper, something that settled quietly in my chest, because whatever was waiting for us out there, whatever had forced him to move this quickly, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer just part of his world. I was part of whatever war was coming next. The road stretched endlessly in front of us, a thin line cutting through darkness that felt too quiet, too controlled, like even the night knew who was moving through it. I sat still in the passenger seat, my hands resting in my lap, but not relaxed, not calm, just waiting for something I could not name. The engine hummed low, steady, the only sound filling the space between us. Luca drove without speaking, his focus fixed ahead, his posture unchanged. Like this was routine, like leaving everything behind in the middle of the night was just another part of his life. I turned slightly, watching him from the corner of my eye, trying to understand how someone could look so composed when everything around them had shifted so suddenly. Where are we going? I asked, finally breaking the silence, because I could not sit there any longer pretending this was normal. He did not answer right away, his hands steady on the wheel, his expression unreadable in the dim light, passing over us in brief flashes. Somewhere secure, he said after a moment, and the way he said it made it clear that was all I was going to get. I looked back out the window, the faint glow of distant lights appearing and disappearing as we moved farther from everything familiar. You keep saying things like that, I said quietly. Secure, safe, stay alive, but you are not actually telling me anything. This time, he glanced at me briefly, not long enough to fully read him, but enough to feel the shift in his attention. Because what matters is not where we are going, he replied. It is who knows we exist once we get there. The words settled into my chest heavier than I expected, because they were not comforting, they were not meant to be, they were a reminder of something. I was only beginning to understand that this was not about distance, it was about control, about being somewhere no one else could reach us. I let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly as the reality of that sank in. And if they find us anyway? I asked before I could stop myself. His jaw tightened, just enough for me to notice before his expression smoothed out again. They will not, he said, and there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty, like he had already planned for every possibility, like the outcome had already been decided long before this moment. I wanted to believe him, I really did, but something inside me resisted, not because I thought he was wrong, but because I did not like how easily he said it, like the world could be controlled if you were powerful enough, like safety was something you could command instead of something fragile. And temporary silence settled again, heavier this time, filled with everything neither of us was saying. I watched the road, the lines blurring together, the miles passing faster than I could process, until the car finally slowed, the shift so subtle I almost missed it at first. Then I saw it ahead, tall gates rising out of the darkness, lights flickering on as we approached, like they had been waiting for us. The gates opened before we even stopped, and the car moved through without pause, the sound of them closing behind us softer than I expected, but final. Like everything else tonight, I straightened slightly, my eyes scanning the area as we drove farther in, the outline of a house coming into view, not as large as the one we had left behind, but not small. Hey, there's something in between, something that felt less like a statement and more like a place that could disappear if it needed to. Luca parked the car near the entrance, the engine cutting off, leaving the silence louder than before. For a moment, neither of us moved, the stillness stretching between us, until he finally turned his head toward me. You are safe here, he said, and the words should have reassured me. They should have settled something inside me. but they did not completely, because I was starting to realize something. Safety in his world did not mean freedom, it meant distance from danger. But still within his reach, I opened the door, slowly stepping out into the cool night air, the ground solid beneath my feet, in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after everything that had happened. I looked around, taking in the quiet, the stillness, the way everything felt contained, like this place existed outside of everything else. Luca came around the car a moment later, his presence immediate, even without touching me, even without speaking. "This is temporary," he said, as if reading the questions I had not asked yet. "Until I know exactly who is behind this." I nodded slowly, even though I did not fully understand what that meant, because something in his tone told me this was not over, this was just the beginning. I followed him toward the house, the door opening before we reached it. Someone inside, already waiting, already prepared, and as I stepped across the threshold into yet another unfamiliar place, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. This was no longer about escaping something, this was about stepping deeper into it. And there was no clear way back. The door closed behind me with a softer sound than I expected, but it still echoed in my chest like a final step. I could not undo. The air inside felt different, warmer, but not comforting, controlled like everything else that belonged to him. I stood just inside the entrance, my fingers tightening slightly around the strap of the bag as my eyes adjusted to the dim lighting. The house was quieter than the last one, smaller, but still precise, every detail placed exactly where it needed to be, nothing out of line, nothing out of control. "This way." His voice came from just ahead of me, calm, steady, like nothing had changed, even though everything had. I followed him, without speaking, my steps slower this time, not because I was hesitant, but because I was trying to take it all in, to understand the space I had just been moved into like a piece on a board. I did not know how to play. The hallway was narrow compared to the one we left behind, but it felt more enclosed, more intentional, like this place was not meant to impress, it was meant to protect. He stopped in front of a door, opening it without hesitation and stepping aside just enough for me to enter. First, I paused for half a second, not because I was afraid, but because I was aware of him behind me, aware of how easily I could walk forward or stay exactly where I was, and how little either option would actually change anything. I stepped inside. The room was simple compared to everything else I had seen: a bed, a dresser, a window partially covered by thick curtains, but it felt real, more real than anything else tonight, like a place someone could actually exist in without being watched every second. "You will stay here," he said from behind me. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze again, the same calm, the same control, but something beneath it that I was starting to recognize. Not softness, not quite concern, something more complicated, something that did not fit into the version of him I had built in my head. "And you?" I asked before I could stop myself. His eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary before he answered, "I will be close." The words were simple, but they carried weight, not distance, not separation, just a boundary that felt chosen, not forced. I nodded once, even though I did not fully understand why that mattered, why the idea of him being close settled something inside me. Instead of making it worse, silence stretched between us again. But this time, it did not feel as sharp, it felt different, like the edges had softened just enough to breathe. "You should rest," he said finally, his voice quieter. Now, not commanding, not demanding, just stating something that made sense, even if nothing else. Did I almost laughed at that. Rest felt impossible in a place like this, in a life like this. But my body disagreed, the exhaustion from everything that had happened pressing down heavier than I could ignore. I set the bag down on the bed, slowly, my movements deliberate, like I was still adjusting to the idea that I could choose them at all. When I looked back up, he was still there, watching, not in a way that felt invasive, but not distant either, something in between, something I could not quite define. "Why me?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, the words hanging in the air, heavier than anything else I had asked tonight. For a second I thought he would not answer, that he would dismiss it like everything else. But he did not. His gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward, like he was considering something carefully before speaking. "Because you did not look away," he said, and the answer caught me off guard, my brow furrowing slightly as I tried to understand what he meant. "At the wedding," he continued, his voice steady, but quieter now. "Everyone else looked down, looked away, acted like I was something they should not see, but you did not." I held his gaze as he spoke, the memory flashing through my mind, the way I had forced myself not to break, not to disappear, even when everything in me wanted to. "That does not mean anything," I said softly, but even as I said it, I was not sure if I believed it. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something that made my chest tighten again. "It does to me," he replied, and for the first time Since this started, I felt it clearly, not control, not power, something else, something that made everything between us more complicated than it should have been. He turned, then stepping back toward the door, like the moment had ended, like whatever had just passed between us was not something he was willing to stay in. Lock the door, he said without looking back. No one comes in without my permission. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him, leaving me alone again, but this time the silence felt different, not empty, not suffocating, something quieter, something waiting. And as I stood there in a room that was supposed to be safe, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else tonight. I was no longer just trying to understand his world. I was starting to understand him, and that was far more dangerous. I did not lock the door right away. I stood there staring at it like the simple act of turning that lock would make everything real in a way I was not ready for. The room felt too quiet now, too still, like it was waiting for me to decide something I could not name. I let out a slow breath and finally moved my fingers, brushing against the cool metal. As I turned the lock into place, the soft click echoed louder than it should have, sealing me inside a space that was supposed to be safe, but did not feel like freedom. I stepped back from the door, my eyes moving slowly across the room again, taking in the small details, the way the bed was perfectly made, the curtains drawn just enough to block the outside world, the faint scent of something clean, something controlled. Nothing here felt accidental. Everything had a purpose, even the silence. I walked toward the window, hesitating for a moment before pulling the curtain aside, just enough to look out. The ground stretched beyond the glass, darker than before, the faint outline of trees moving slightly in the night breeze. The gates somewhere beyond that, unseen but present, like a boundary I could not cross even if I tried. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, the cool surface grounding me for a second. As my thoughts caught up with everything that had happened, I should have felt trapped. I should have felt panicked, but instead there was something else, something quieter, something more complicated, because for the first time I was not being ignored. I was being watched, protected, and I did not know which one unsettled me more. I pulled the curtain back into place, turning away from the window as the weight of exhaustion settled deeper into my body. Each step toward the bed slower than the last, like I was carrying more than just the events of tonight. I sat down carefully, the mattress soft beneath me, but unfamiliar. Like everything else, I reached for the bag, opening it slowly, my hands moving through the few things I had packed without thinking. Earlier clothes I barely recognized, a life that already felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. I paused, my fingers resting on the fabric, as a thought slipped in uninvited. This was all I had left. Everything else was behind me, unreachable, and maybe already irrelevant. I closed the bag again, setting it aside as I leaned back slightly, my eyes lifting toward the ceiling, the quiet pressing in again, heavier this time, but not suffocating, just present, like it was giving me space to think. Something I was not sure I wanted. A sound broke through the silence, not loud, not sharp, just a faint movement outside the room. My body stilled instantly, my breath catching as I listened. Closer footsteps, maybe, or something softer, I could not tell, but it was enough to pull me back to awareness, to remind me that I was not alone here, not completely. I sat up slowly, my gaze shifting toward the door, my heart beating a little faster, now not from fear exactly, but from the uncertainty of what came next. I waited a few seconds, the sound fading until it was gone, leaving the silence even heavier than before. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, my shoulders easing slightly as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just someone moving through the house, just another part of a world I did not understand yet. But even as I told myself that, I could not shake the feeling that something had changed, not outside but inside me, something that had shifted. The moment he looked at me and said those words, because it was not just about staying alive anymore, it was about what that meant in a world where survival came with conditions. I lay back slowly, staring up at the ceiling again, my mind replaying everything, every word, every glance, every moment where he had chosen something different than what I expected, the way he had stopped, the way he had looked at me, like I was not just another obligation, not just another piece in whatever game he was playing. And that was the part one could not ignore, the part that made everything more dangerous, because understanding him meant getting closer to something I should probably stay away from. I turned my head slightly, my eyes drifting toward the door again, the lock still in place, the barrier still there, but it did not feel like protection anymore. It felt like a line I was standing behind, unsure if I wanted to cross it or not. And as the quiet stretched on into the night, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. This was not just a place I was being kept safe. This was a place where something was beginning to change, and I was not sure if I was ready for what that would mean. I did not remember falling asleep, but I knew I must have because when I opened my eyes the room looked different, softer, like the edges had blurred sometime during the night. For a second, I did not move. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together where I was and why everything felt so unfamiliar. Then it hit me all at once: the wedding, the car, the house, and my chest tightened slightly as I pushed myself up. Sitting on the edge of the bed, the silence was still there, but it felt lighter now, like the world outside had shifted into something less immediate, less urgent. I stood slowly, my feet touching the floor with hesitation, like I expected something to feel different, but nothing did. The room remained exactly the same, controlled, quiet, contained. I moved toward the window again, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let the early morning light spill, and it was faint, soft, stretching across the grounds in pale gold lines that made everything look almost peaceful, like nothing dangerous could exist in a place like this. But I knew better now. Appearances here meant nothing. I let the curtain fall back into place, turning away as I ran a hand through my hair, trying to steady my thoughts. The events of last night replayed in fragments, his voice, his presence, the way everything seemed to shift around him. And the part one could not ignore, the part that unsettled me the most, was not the danger. It was the way I had started to understand him, even just a little. I moved toward the door, my steps slow, deliberate, as I reached for the handle, my fingers pausing just before touching it. I remembered what he said: no one comes in without my permission, but he had not said anything about leaving. I hesitated only for a second before unlocking it, the click quieter this time, less final. I opened the door slowly, stepping into the hallway. The air outside felt different, less heavy than before, but still controlled, like everything here existed under the same invisible rules. I took a few steps forward, my eyes scanning the space, trying to orient myself, trying to decide what I was supposed to do now that I was not being told where to stand or when to move. A voice broke through the silence behind me. You should not be wandering alone. I turned quickly, my breath catching slightly as I saw him standing at the end of the hallway, his posture relaxed, but his presence anything. But he looked like he had not slept, his shirt sleeves rolled up slightly, his hair not as perfectly controlled as before, but his eyes were the same, sharp, focused, taking everything in at once. I needed to know where I was, I said quietly, holding his gaze instead of looking away. He watched me for a moment, longer than necessary, like he was measuring something unseen, before he stepped closer, closing the distance between us with that same controlled movement I was starting to recognize. And now you do, he said. It was not a question. I shook my head slightly. Not really, I admitted, and for a second something flickered in his expression, not frustration, not impatience, something closer to understanding, like he had expected that answer. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands resting loosely at his sides, but there was nothing casual about the way he stood. This place is not meant to be understood, he said. It is meant to keep you out of reach. The words settled into my chest again, heavy, but familiar now. I let out a slow breath, my eyes searching his face for something more, something beyond the controlled answers he kept giving me. And you, I asked softly, where do you fit into that? The question lingered between us longer than I expected, his gaze holding mine steady, unflinching, and for a moment I thought he would deflect again, avoid it like everything else, but he did not. I am the reason it works, he said simply, and there it was again, that certainty, that control, that quiet power that shaped everything around him. I should have felt frustrated, I should have pushed back, but instead I felt something else, something deeper, something that made me hesitate before speaking again. And what happens if you are wrong? I asked before I could stop myself. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like I had just said something that mattered more than anything else I had asked so far. I am not wrong, he replied, but this time there was a slight pause before the words, like even he knew that was not entirely true, like even he understood that control had limits, and for the first time since I met him I saw it clearly, not weakness, not doubt, but something close to uncertainty. And that was when I realized something that changed everything. If he could be wrong even for a second, then this world he controlled was not as unbreakable as it seemed, and neither was he. The moment I realized he could be wrong, everything inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, dangerous way that settled deep in my chest, because it meant this world he controlled was not as absolute as it felt. And if it was not absolute, then neither was my place in it, neither was the role he had decided for me. Luca did not look away from me, his gaze steady, like he was waiting for something, like he knew I had seen it. That brief flicker, that hesitation, that made him human for just a second. You think you have control over everything, I said softly, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them, and for the first time. I did not feel small when I said them. I felt steady. His expression did not change, but something in the air between us did, something sharper, something more focused, like I had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I do not think, he replied, his voice calm, but firmer now. I know what I can control and what I cannot. I held his gaze, my pulse steady, even as something inside me reacted to the way he said it, not defensive, not angry, just certain, like he had already measured the limits of his world and accepted them long ago. And I am one of those things you think you can control? I asked quietly, the question hanging between us heavier than anything else this time. He did not answer right away, and that pause said more than any words could. His eyes searched mine, not aggressively, not demanding, just looking like he was trying to understand something that did not fit into his usual expectations. You are part of my responsibility now, he said finally, and the way he chose those words, instead of something else, did not go unnoticed by me. Responsibility, not possession, not control, something different, something that complicated everything. I felt my breath catch slightly, but I did not look away. That is not the same thing, I said, and this time my voice was stronger, more certain, because I knew I was right. His jaw tightened just enough for me to see it, but he did not argue, not immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, closing the distance again, but this time it felt different, not like pressure, not like dominance, something else, something more measured. No, it is not, he admitted, and that single admission shifted something again, something I could not fully explain, because I had expected resistance. I had expected him to shut the conversation down like he had done before, but he did not, and that made everything more complicated than it should have been. Silence stretched between us, but it was not the same silence as before. It was not empty, it was filled with something unspoken, something that neither of us seemed ready to define. Yet a sound broke through it, suddenly sharp enough to pull both of us out of the moment. His phone vibrating in his hand, he glanced down briefly, his expression changing instantly, the softness gone, replaced by something colder, more precise. Stay inside, he said without looking at me, his attention already shifting to whatever message had appeared. I am serious, do not leave this hallway. His tone was different now, not just controlled, but edged with urgency, something I had not heard from him before. I watched him turn, moving down the hall, quickly, his steps purposeful, as he answered the call, his voice dropping lower, too quiet for me to hear the words, but I could see it in the way he moved, the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand tightened slightly at his side. Something had changed again, something outside of this place, outside of this conversation. I stood there for a second longer, my thoughts racing, as I tried to process everything at once, his words, his reactions, the way he had admitted something he did not have to admit, and then just like that he was gone again, pulled back into whatever world existed beyond these walls. I turned slowly, my eyes moving down the hallway in the opposite direction, the quiet settling back in around me. But it did not feel the same anymore. It felt thinner, like something had cracked beneath the surface, like the illusion of complete control had fractured just enough for me to see through it. I took a small step forward, then stopped. His voice echoed in my head, stay inside, do not leave this hallway. And for a moment I hesitated, not because I was afraid of what would happen if I disobeyed, but because I was starting to understand what it meant when he said things like that. It was not just about control, it was about consequence, about the kind of world where one wrong move could change everything. I exhaled, slowly forcing myself to stay where I was, my hands resting loosely at my sides as I waited. But this time, I was not just waiting for him, I was thinking, watching, understanding, because the more I saw, the more I realized something that settled deep in my chest. This was not just his world anymore, and if there were cracks in it, then sooner or later something or someone was going to break through them. I stayed where I was even after he disappeared down the hall, his words still echoing in my mind, not as a command, but as a warning, the kind you only understood after it was too late. The silence returned, slowly filling the space around me, but it felt thinner now, like something had already slipped through the cracks. I did not move at first, I just listened, my breathing steady, my senses sharper than before, because now I knew this place was not as untouchable as it seemed. A faint murmur drifted from somewhere deeper in the house, low voices, not loud enough to understand, but enough to remind me I was not alone here. Not really. I took a step forward before I could stop myself, my instincts pulling me toward the sound, not out of curiosity, but something else, something stronger, something that felt like awareness growing in real time. I stopped again, forcing myself to breathe, to think, because I remembered what he said, stay inside, do not leave this hallway. And for a moment, I almost listened completely, almost stayed. exactly where I was supposed to be, but then I thought about what I had seen, the hesitation, the cracks, the fact that even he did not control everything, and that changed something inside me. I took another step slower this time, my feet silent against the floor, as I moved just far enough to see around the corner. The hallway opened slightly, revealing part of another room, not fully visible, but enough to catch fragments. Lucas stood inside, his back partially turned, his posture rigid in a way I had not seen before, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something sharper, something close to anger. "No, you listen to me," he said, and even without hearing the other side, I knew this was not a normal conversation. "She is not part of this." The words hit me harder than anything else. "Not part of this." My chest tightened slightly, my fingers curling at my sides, because I did not know what that meant anymore. I was already here, already pulled into something I did not understand. How could I not be part of it? I leaned slightly closer, not enough to be seen, but enough to hear more. His voice dropped again, quieter now, but more dangerous in its calm. "Then you are making a mistake," he said, "and I do not tolerate mistakes that involve her." The way he said her, not my wife, not a name, just her, made something shift inside me, something I could not ignore, because it was not about ownership, it was something else, something more personal, more deliberate. There was a pause, a long one, and I could feel it, even from where I stood, the tension, the weight of whatever was being said on the other end. Then his shoulders straightened slightly, his head tilting just a fraction, like he had made a decision. "Then we are done here," he said, and the finality in his voice left no room for anything else. The call ended a second later, the silence that followed louder than before. I stepped back quickly, my heart beating faster, now not from fear, but from the realization that I had just heard something I was not supposed to hear. I returned to where I had been standing, just as his footsteps approached, the sound measured, controlled, like nothing had happened, like everything was exactly as it should be. He turned the corner a moment later, his eyes finding me. Instantly, like he already knew, I had not stayed exactly where he left me, and for a second neither of us spoke. The space between us filled with everything unsaid, everything understood without being acknowledged. "You should not be standing here," he said finally, his voice calm, but there was something underneath it now, something tighter, something that had not been there before. I met his gaze, holding it steady, because I was no longer pretending I did not see what was happening. "Neither should you," I replied quietly. And that was when it shifted again, not the situation, not the danger, but something between us, something that had been building slowly, piece by piece, and now stood right in front of us, undeniable. His expression did not change, but his eyes did, something subtle, something that made my breath catch, because it was not anger, not frustration, it was recognition, like he had just realized something about me that he could not ignore. "You heard enough," he said, and it was not a question. I nodded once, because there was no point pretending otherwise. The silence stretched again, but this time it was not empty, it was charged, filled with something that felt like the beginning of a line neither of us knew how to cross. "Then you understand," he continued, his voice lower, now more controlled. "This is not something you can step in and out of when it suits you." I held his gaze, my pulse steady, even as the weight of his words settled deeper. "I never stepped into it," I said quietly. "You brought it to me." And there it was, the truth laid out between us, simple, undeniable, and for the first time since this started, he did not have an immediate answer. He just stood there looking at me like he was seeing me. Clearly not as a responsibility, not as something to protect, but as someone who had already crossed into his world, whether he intended it or not. And that was when I realized something that changed everything. This was no longer about keeping me safe. This was about what happened now that I was already involved. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air between us thick with something that no longer felt like confusion. It felt like truth, exposed in a way neither of us could take back. I watched him carefully, the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way his eyes did not leave mine, like he was recalculating something he thought he already understood. "You are right," he said finally. And the words landed heavier than anything else, because I had not expected them, not from him, not like this. "I brought this to you." His voice was steady, but lower, now more controlled, like each word had to pass through something before it reached me. I felt my breath catch slightly, not because of what he said, but because of what it meant. He was not denying it, he was not shifting it, he was owning it. And that changed everything again. Silence stretched, but it did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt like a line had been crossed, and neither of us could step back over it. "Then stop trying to keep me out of it," I said quietly, the words surprising even me, because I did not know when that shift had happened, when I had gone from wanting to escape to wanting to understand. His eyes sharpened slightly, not in anger, but in focus like I had just said something that mattered more than anything else. You do not understand what you are asking. For, he replied, and this time there was something beneath his control, something closer to restraint, like he was holding something back not from me, but from himself. I held his gaze steady, refusing to look away. Then explain it to me, I said, and this time my voice did not waver, not even a little, because I meant it. I was done standing on the edge of something I did not understand. I was already here, already involved, whether he wanted it or not. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders shifting. Just enough for me to see it, not gone, but different, like he was making a decision that did not come easily. This is not a world you step into and walk away from, he said. Once you see it, once you understand it, there is no version of your life that goes back to what it was before. I listened carefully, the weight of his words settling deeper, because I knew he was not exaggerating. This was not a warning meant to scare me. It was a reality he had already accepted long ago, that already happened. I replied softly. The moment I walked down that aisle, there was no going back. His gaze held mine longer this time, like he was searching for hesitation, something he could use to pull me back. But there was none, not anymore. Something in his expression shifted again, something quieter, something that looked almost like acceptance, but not fully, not yet. You are asking to be part of something that will change how you see everything. He continued, his voice lower, now more deliberate. It will not make sense at first, and even when it does, you may wish it did not. I let out a slow breath, my hands steady at my sides, because I understood what he was saying more than he probably realized. I already do not understand anything, I said, so what difference does it make if I learn the truth instead of guessing at it? That seemed to stop him, not completely, but enough that I could see it, the way his focus sharpened, the way his attention shifted fully to me, like I had just stepped into a space he did not expect me to enter. You are not afraid, he said, and this time it was not a question. I thought about that for a second, about everything that had happened, everything that could still happen, and realized something that surprised even me. I admitted, but I am more afraid of not knowing what is happening around me than I am of understanding it. The silence that followed was different again, not tense, not uncertain, something closer to clarity, like something had just settled into place between us. He took a step closer, not enough to invade, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to change the space between us. Then you stay close to me, he said, and this time it was not a command, not exactly. It felt more like a decision, one he had already made. You do not act without telling me, you do not trust anyone without reason, and you do not assume anything. I nodded slowly, taking in each word not as rules, but as something else, something closer to survival instructions. And in return, I said quietly, because I understood enough now to know nothing in his world came without terms. His eyes held mine steady, the silence stretching just long enough to matter before he answered. In return, I tell you what you need to know. And there it was, not everything, not full trust, but something real, something that had not been there before, something earned, not given freely. And as I stood there looking at him, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. This was no longer about being protected or controlled. This was something else, something far more dangerous, because now I was choosing to step forward instead of being pulled. And that meant whatever came next would not just belong to his world, it would belong to me too. Something settled between us after that, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that changed everything. The air did not feel as heavy, the silence did not feel as uncertain. It felt defined, like we had crossed into something neither of us had planned, but neither of us was stepping away from. Luca did not move immediately, his gaze still on mine, like he was making sure I understood what I had just agreed to, what I had just stepped into. And I did understand, maybe not every detail, maybe not every consequence, but enough to know this was not something I could walk back from. Then we start now, he said finally, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made my pulse steady instead of race. I nodded once, because there was no hesitation left in me, not anymore. Whatever fear I had felt before had shifted into something else, something sharper, something that felt like awareness. He turned slightly, gesturing for me to follow. And this time, I did not hesitate. I moved with him down the hallway, my steps more certain than before, not because I felt safe, but because I understood that standing still was no longer an option. We entered the room I had only seen a glimpse of earlier, the one where he had taken that call. It was not large, but it was different from the rest of the house. Screens lined one wall, maps spread across a table, documents placed with precise order, like everything here was meant to be analyzed, understood, controlled. He stepped forward without pause, his focus already shifting to the information in front of him. Like this was where he belonged, like this was The center of everything. I stopped just inside the room, my eyes taking in the details, the structure, the purpose, the way nothing here felt accidental. They know about the marriage, he said without looking at me, his attention on the screen as he pulled up something I could not fully see yet. That means they expected me to keep you visible, to use you as leverage. The word leverage settled into my chest differently, this time not as something abstract, but something real, something I could understand. Now, but you moved me, I said quietly, stepping closer without thinking, his head tilted slightly, acknowledging the statement without turning. I changed the expectation, he replied, which means they will adjust. I watched the screen as he stepped aside, just enough for me to see it, a map, locations marked, patterns I did not fully recognize, but I could see the intention behind them, the movement, the strategy. So this is not over, I said, more to myself than to him, but he heard it. Of course he did. He always did. It just started, he said, and the calm in his voice made the words feel heavier, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just true. I crossed my arms slightly, not in defense, but in thought, my mind already working through what I was seeing, what I was hearing, trying to connect it into something that made sense. Then tell me what they want, I said, because that was the only place to start. His gaze shifted to me, then fully focused, fully present, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no distance in the way he looked at me. Control, he said simply. Not just over territory, not just over influence, but over decisions, and the fastest way to force that is to create pressure where it matters most. I held his gaze, understanding settling in piece by piece. I said quietly, they want control over you. Something in his expression changed slightly, not denial, not resistance, just acknowledgement. And now they think they have a way to get it, he added, his eyes locking onto mine again. But this time it felt different, not like he was assessing me, but like he was including me in something that had always been his alone. But they are wrong, I said before I could stop myself, and the moment the words left my mouth, I felt it, the shift, the way something between us aligned in a way it had not before, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. His gaze held mine for a second longer, and then something unexpected happened, not a smile, not anything obvious, just the faintest change in his expression, something that felt like approval. Yes, he said quietly, they are. Silence followed, but it was not empty, it was filled with something new, something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of understanding. I looked back at the map, the lines, the points, the strategy unfolding in front of me, and for the first time, I did not feel like an outsider looking in. I felt like I was part of it, not as something being moved, but as someone who could see, who could understand, who could choose. And that was when it fully settled in, not fear, not doubt, but something steady, something real, because this was no longer about surviving his world, this was about standing in it. And as I stood there beside him, looking at everything that was about to unfold, I realized something that changed everything. I had not just married a man with power, I had stepped into a world that would test every part of me, and the most dangerous part was not that I might lose myself in it, it was that I might not want to leave.